I am here tonight to tell you a story about my son and I. Max. Max grew up in Colorado Springs. We have a blended family. My husband has 2 children, Quinn and Ingrid, and I have 2 children, Jesse and Max. Max is the youngest. And I think that most of the kids, all the kids, had a fairly normal upbringing, given the fact that there's always trouble of some kind. But Max was happy. He was the quietest of the kids, probably the most sensitive, but generally did well. Boy Scouts, Little League. And he went to Steele Elementary, and he went to North Junior High, and he graduated from the IB program at Palmer. And then he went to Grinnell College in Iowa. And in the fall of 1999, he was a junior in college, just starting his junior year. It was September, and I got a phone call from him. And he said, "Mom, turn on the news. There's been an epiphany." Being the mom I am, hoping that it really was the world that had shifted and not my son, I turned on the news. And it was the old regular stuff, reruns, news, nothing out of the ordinary. So I called Max back, and he said, "Mom, you just don't understand." And he hung up the phone. And he walked out the door that day, out of the house that he shared with 5 other college friends, and began walking down the middle of Grinnell, small town, down the yellow line, no shoes, and he was on his way to California. He didn't get too far. The police picked him up, and fortunately they took him to the hospital. My husband and I got there the next day, Des Moines, and Max was amazing. He was performing handstands at the nurse's station. I never knew he could do anything like that. He was talking about philosophy and a mixed metaphorical world that in some ways was very enchanting. The social workers took my husband and I into a room, and he said, "Your son has bipolar 1, classic bipolar 1. That means that he has severe episodes of mania that eventually develop into psychosis, and he ends up in the hospital." So we took him home, and he went into Cedar Springs for a couple of weeks, and then he came home, and we nurtured him the best we could. He was not psychotic anymore, but not quite what Max likes to call baseline. Eventually he got there, but then in October, he sunk into the most horrible suicidal depression. And bipolar disorder, that's what it's called, Manic Depression. And we kept an eye on him. We didn't leave him alone ever. Max says, when he describes it in this book that we wrote, it was an ache in his head, in his joints, in his entire body. And he spent every waking moment thinking about how to end his life, whether it was with a knife or a gun or jumping off the Royal Gorge Bridge or you name it. He had thought about it. But Max is a really strong kid, and I just admire him so much because he has been able always to get through those horrible, horrible depressions. In January of that year, he was on his way back to some sort of normalcy, still depressed, And he decided he wanted to go back to school, so he went back to school for the spring semester in January. And that was really hard because he had been at school talking to people about the world that was developing, and he had been talking to everybody on campus about that. He'd been talking about it to all his friends and all his professors, and he was profoundly embarrassed. And somehow he just managed to face those people and get through it. He says something to the effect that, how can you predict the end of the world and then take extra credits to graduate on time? But he was also very afraid of the academics. He just wasn't sure that he could do it. But he made it through. He made it through that semester, and he made it through the next semester. And, you begin to think, well, maybe this was just a fluke. Maybe it was the planets out of alignment. Maybe things were going to be okay. Well, in 2001, during spring break, he went to Chicago on spring break, and he disappeared. He was just gone. We had no idea where he was. I didn't know whether he was bleeding in a back alley of Chicago or had been arrested or what had happened to him, and it was days and days before we found out. He was just simply walking the streets of Chicago in some pretty rough neighborhoods. Finally, we got the call that he had been admitted to Northwestern Hospital. In the meantime, he had given his car away. He had hooked up with some gangbangers. He had just been really out there, and he had put himself in a lot of danger. But again, he got through it. He came home again and recovered, and that was when we knew, yes, this really wasn't just a fluke. He really was sick. And so after that episode, he had an episode every year from 2001 until 2006. So again, his episodes, he doesn't have an episode in which he doesn't end up in the hospital. So it's the mania that is creeping up into psychosis, which involves, can involve hallucinations, certainly for Max, delusions. And he has been in really nasty situations, really dangerous situations. He's been homeless. He's been arrested numerous times. He has been suicidal. He once was arrested in Michelle's, and you probably all remember Michelle's. It's closed now. But we used to go there as a family all the time to celebrate some sort of whatever success our kids had accomplished. It was a family kind of tradition. We would go there. And so Max went there, manic and psychotic. And although he's never been dangerous, people were very disturbed by his behavior. And so the police came, and they arrested him, and they handcuffed him, and they threw him in the back of the squad car, and he's saying, I'm bipolar, I have bipolar disorder. They took him to Memorial Hospital and ran every test in the books, including a spinal tap, which was really, really nasty. Finally, he was sent over to the Lighthouse, which is the crisis center in Colorado Springs, and was there for 2 days, and I was able to get him into Cedar Springs Hospital. So that was sort of typical of what happened. I think the closest he ever came to really killing himself, he was in Philadelphia. He was at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he had a studio on the 8th floor. And he was in really bad shape. And he threw a huge bolt that he had in his studio out the window. And then he started throwing everything else in his studio out the window. Paintings, canvases floating down to the sidewalk, paints, turpentine, brushes, you name it. His futon was about the last thing left, and he took it apart and he threw his futon out. So the studio was empty, and he was the only thing left in it. So the most logical, I guess you could say, though not really, thing to do was to go out the window next. So he took a running leap towards the window, and he stopped this far from the edge. And he said to me later, and even in the book, he said, "I can only assume that I was too afraid to die." But I really don't think that that's all of it. I think Max has a really strong inner core, and I think he knows really well what losing him would do to me and the rest of the family. And so in spite of how much pain he's been in, he hangs in there. And I'll tell you what, I don't know if you've ever seen anybody that's really depressed, but it is painful. And there's nothing you can say to change that. All you can do is be with them and let him know how much he's loved. So as a result, I've spent hundreds and hundreds of hours in psychiatric units because I never wanted Max to feel abandoned. I wanted him to know that I was in this with him. It was his illness, and it was mine too. He would not have to go through this by himself. So I was kind of on the unit, whether it was visiting hours or not, and they just put up with me. Some of the clients, I'd come through the door and they'd say, "Hey, Max's mom, let me show you where Max is," and they'd escort me back to where Matthew was. I got to know a lot of the clients. Some of them were very, very happy because they were very, very manic, and some of them were very, very depressed. One young man, I think he was probably about 16, he used to call me Ruthie, and he asked me to the prom. I told him I didn't have a dress. And he kind of thought, "Oh yeah, okay, that's okay." There was another guy on one of the units who would come and sit with Max and me all the time, and he had no hair, he was shaved head, and he had tattoos that wound around his neck and up around his ears, and a teardrop beside his eye. And he would come and sit with us because he knew I always had cinnamon gum in my pocket, and he knew I would always give him some cinnamon gum. But the rumor on the unit was that he was hiding from the mob. And I'm going, wait a minute, this is just about the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Until I thought about it, and I realized how real things really were on these units and how bizarre things could be. And the other thing that happened, though, as I spent a lot of time trying to find Max help, was I began to realize how completely broken our mental health care system is. We could not find him the help he needed. And, we have resources, we're somewhat intelligent, we should have been able to find the help, but as it turns out, nobody can find the help. And I overstate that, but there's no outpatient care when folks are released from the hospital. when they are in the hospital, the psych units. The psych unit at Northwestern Hospital in Chicago was amazing. A university hospital, unbelievable. But it was the best place Max ever was. In all the hospitalizations he had, treatment was pretty inferior. There is no real treatment, really. It's just load on the drugs and get them stable enough to get them out. And then when they're out, no outpatient care, no resources in terms of housing. Now, Max had us, so those with family members who continue to stay involved have a better time of it. But there are so many that don't, and they end up in jail, and they end up homeless. Max has been restrained, tied down. He's been isolated in small rooms, and he's been physically abused by staff members who, in his case, had just become hardened. They were these big orderlies, nurses, and that was the way they handled people. In most cases, I think the staff is just undertrained, and they don't have the resources they need, and they don't have the training they need to really understand how to de-escalate a situation. So I think the worst thing that happened, Max was in Colorado Springs, and this was when he was arrested the first time at Michelle's. He was in and out of the hospital that time 3 different times. They would keep him for 9 days, which I figure was some formula from the insurance company, and released him with a bag full of meds. And he wasn't stable. So he'd be out for 2 weeks, he would not come home, and he was back in for another 9 days. And so the third hospitalization, the doctor, a nurse actually called me, a social worker, and she said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but there is no hope for Max. He is not ever going to get better." And of course, I pretty much shattered. But then, of course, we met with the doctor. We wanted to know what the heck was going on and why were they saying this. Well, part of it was because he wasn't recovering. And I attribute that to 3 different hospitalizations, one kind of med after another, after another, after another. But my husband and I went to talk to the doctor, and the doctor said, "You just better get him into a boarding house. He cannot take care of himself. He's not going to get better, and you just better do this." Well, I wasn't going to accept that. I got really angry, really, really angry. I've been angry all along. Probably not as much as I used to be, but I've been really angry at the lack of services and the kind of care that's been available. And so eventually I got connected with NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and I started teaching their classes, running their programs. I joined the board of directors. This is in Colorado Springs, and I just finished my term as president last year. And what that allowed me to do was to turn my anger into advocacy. I believe strongly in advocating for those with mental illness and their families. The families need as much help as those who have mental illness, I think. When the families are involved, there's more hope for the person they love. So let's see. In spite of what that doctor said, Max has been living on his own for many, many years. He's had his own apartment. He was in Philadelphia. He did get his bachelor's from Grinnell College, and then he went on to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and he got his MFA. He lives in Denver now. He's done some teaching. He's a very, very serious artist, and knock on wood, he's doing well. But we all know that anything can happen, and we're vigilant. But he has, I think, finally come to understand his illness. So he was stable for about 4 years, from 2006 till 2010, and then had a major episode in 2010, which is now 3 years ago. And it was a bad one. He says it's the worst he's ever had. He was got on a bus and went to Philadelphia and was just gone and roaming the streets of Philadelphia. But since then, he's done well. He's married. He got married in June. And in 2008, we decided to write a book together. My motivation was I wanted people to know who Max is. I wanted them to understand what a completely amazing person he is, because there's so much judgment with mental illness. And I feel strongly that when people see the face behind the illness, that judgment melts and stigma disappears. So my mantra has become, we all need to tell our stories. When I asked Max if he'd write the book with me, he said, well, okay, but it'll probably take a while. And it did, 5 years. But we did it. It was really, really hard. It was so painful to go through those memories, and so traumatic to relive that. But in another way, it was very cathartic, and we became, we grew to understand things more than we ever had before, and it was healing. And as it turns out, since the book's come out, which was in April, I've begun to realize how completely redeeming and validating it is. Max and I have spent several, book signings, and we've done events, and he is so open and so honest about his illness, and he's so articulate, and people are just very, very interested in what he has to say, and that has been really good for him. And it's really been good for me, too. I think it's helped us both in our recovery. So, of course, I have to show you the book. This is it. It's called Walks on the Margins, A Story of Bipolar Illness. The artwork on the front is Max's. He designed the cover and the entire interior as well. We alternate chapters. He writes a chapter, then I write a chapter, and we go back and forth. And I'm proud of the book, and I think he is too. It's available at Poor Richard's.